Hey everyone, welcome to our online version of our Exercise Prescription 201 class. My name is James Sauchin. I'm a kinesiologist working for the Edmonton Oliver Primary Care Network. Before we get started up, I'll just give you a little bit of information about myself so you know who's this guy that's talking to you throughout this presentation. So as I said, my name is James. I am a kinesiologist at the Primary Care Network. A little bit about my background. I have my undergraduate degree in kinesiology from the University of Alberta, and I'm a certified clinical exercise physiologist through the American College of Sports Medicine, as well as a certified personal trainer through the Canadian Society of Exercise Physiology. And my role at the clinic essentially is to help people understand the relationship between exercise and potentially a medical condition that they might have, or just understanding all of us need to exercise at some level if we hope to feel good as we're aging. Want to keep our heart healthy, our lungs healthy, our bones strong, our muscles strong. It takes a little bit of work to do that if we want to maintain that as we age. So without further ado, we'll get into the topic for today, which is exercise prescription. So we'll be talking a little bit about maybe some of the thought process that went behind some of the workouts I might have given to some of you, or how you can just start thinking about workouts when you're planning for the future. So on the agenda for today, we'll be looking at a quick review of our Active Living 101 class, a lot of principles that were taught in that class that will still apply to what we're going to be doing here in the exercise prescription now that we're starting to think a little bit more about specific exercise. We'll talk about Canada's physical activity guidelines, so just a little bit about, how much exercise should a person aim to be getting per week and what types of exercise. And then we're going to get into the FIT principle, which is essentially just a way we can formulate a plan to help plan our exercise throughout the week to make sure we're not missing any exercise that we should be getting and that we're getting enough of everything as well. So a quick review of the Active Living 101. If you haven't seen this presentation, it is uploaded on our website as well. So I do encourage you to check that presentation out. Even if you have a pretty good idea of how much activity to get throughout the day, I would go over some pretty good information. So we'll start off with the review. We always want to be thinking about our posture. So if you remember that getting organized while standing handout, that was part of that presentation. We want to keep all of those cues in mind. So I'll review them really quickly with everyone here. So first point, remember this is while we're standing up nice and upright. You're going to want your feet pointed straight ahead. Want to think about our heels kind of like the screw, and we want to be actively screwing our feet into the ground, so to speak. So engaging the muscles that would help us turn our feet out slightly without actually letting our feet turn out, which will instinctively get some muscles around our butt area engaging, which brings us to the second point, which is just to squeeze your butt muscles. So you can clench those butt muscles for a second just to get a feel for them again, and then understanding you just want that minor engagement when you're standing, walking, doing other exercise. The third point, you're going to take that big breath in and out. You can take a big breath in as you breathe out, breathing all the air out while also trying to tighten up or engage your abdominal wall. The fourth point, just having your palms forward, squeezing our shoulder blades essentially. So when you have your palms forward, it's easy to get those muscles engaging that help pull the shoulders back, pull our mid-spine a little more upright. So again, palms forward, squeeze those shoulder blades for a second, get a feel for how that should feel, and then realize you can still stabilize the shoulder with the shoulder muscles while you move your arms around at the elbow, doing whatever it is you may be doing. And then the final point, trying to keep your head over top of your shoulders, your hips, and your ankles as best you can. Next, we talked a little bit about just the negative effects of sitting all day long if you do have a job or activities that require you to sit quite a bit. So it's important to get up. Talked a little bit about the chronic pain cycle. So we do understand that sometimes people might have a chronic pain condition that makes things a little bit harder, but we don't want to just let that pain stop us from doing everything altogether. That's usually not a recommended intervention if you're having chronic pain. But finding the things that you can do so you can start building off of those and start making some improvements for yourself. We burn a lot of calories, neat calories as we call them, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So all the calories that a person would burn during their daily activities that are not specifically exercise. So again, the more we're doing throughout the day in general, the more calories you're going to burn. If you have a weight management goal, that can be a very positive thing with proper diet to help manage that weight. As well as just making sure we're aware of how much calories we need just to perform our day or whatever it may be doing. But the more we're doing throughout the day, the more calories we're going to burn, and that's usually a positive thing. If we do have to sit, we reviewed some tips about how to make sure we're optimizing our sitting mechanics, doing as little harm as possible to our spine, our hips, our shoulders, etc. When we are having to sit for those prolonged periods of time. And the last point, we don't want you just to move, we want you to think about that quality of movement. So making sure that you're being mindful of those getting organized while standing, posture cues to help organize the muscles around your spine properly and reduce the amount of harm we might be doing to them when we're in those prolonged periods of sitting or slouching, whatever it may be. So if that's some information that you haven't gotten yet, as I said, would recommend checking out that Active Living 101. If this is stuff you already know or you've already seen that lecture, we're going to move on. So to start off with, we're going to be going over Canadian Physical Activity Guidelines. We'll be talking about 18 to 64. We'll briefly look at 65 years and older. You'll see as I go through it, it's pretty much identical to 18 to 64, other than there's a few things they want you to think about a little bit more. So to start off, to achieve health benefits, adults aged 18 to 64 years old should accumulate at least 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity aerobic physical activity per week and bouts of 10 minutes or more. So what this is talking about is that continual movement that people do, ideally for 10 minutes or longer. We're going to talk a little bit more about types of aerobic exercise, as well as what a moderate intensity is, what a vigorous intensity is, etc. You do also want to try to get in at least 2 days per week of muscle and bone strengthening activities, hitting most major muscle groups. When we're looking at these numbers, what these are pertaining to, on the next slide here is just some of the benefits you can get from exercise. So if you're making a point of reaching these levels of exercise per week, should have a fairly significant impact on managing a lot of these different health conditions or situations that can occur for a person. So reducing our risk of premature death, heart disease, stroke, high blood pressure, certain types of cancer, type 2 diabetes, osteoporosis, overweight or obesity, can lead to improved fitness, strength, and mental health. So again, you can look at all of these benefits. If you remember those Active Living 101 slides from our previous lecture, you might notice that there's a very big similarity between our exercise-related benefits as well as our general activity benefits that we'd get. And that's why we always recommend, the exercise is very important. We're going to talk about the exercise more today, but that general activity you get all throughout the day is probably equally as important, or potentially even more, depending on how sedentary a person might be throughout the day. So if you're making a point of doing your exercise that's a little bit more targeted at maybe a specific health goal that you have or a specific condition that you're combating, on top of all that general activity, that's where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck, so to speak, or be in the best situation from a physical activity and exercise standpoint to make sure you're doing what you need to do to help take care of yourself. So we'll briefly look at 65 years and older. I'm sure as you're looking through this, you'll notice it is identical. There is no age where we decide that you've done enough, stop exercising. If you want to still have the benefits of exercise, you've got to make a point of having it in your lifestyle lifelong. So again, still want to get that 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity exercise, ideally 10 minutes or more. We'll talk about this a little bit more later on in the presentation here. You still want to make sure you're getting at least 2 days per week of muscle and bone strengthening activity. As you are over the age of 65, they add in an extra recommendation. Those with poor mobility should perform physical activities to enhance balance and prevent falls. So a lot of times, potentially as we're older, falling, we're all going to fall probably at any age, but as you get older, depending on the condition of your body at that point, might be a little more detrimental versus if you were to have a fall when you're 22 or something like that. But I would argue at the end of the day, we all don't want to fall. We all want to make sure that we're keeping our bones and muscles strong enough to handle a fall. So I would argue these should be just the recommendations for everyone anyways. And again, you'll notice fairly similar, you're going to get fairly similar trade-off from ages 18 to 64 would get, but they put in a little more information on this one, just other aspects that might be a little bit more important or might hit a little bit more home for any of our older adults that are checking out this presentation or looking at these guidelines. So again, just reduces the risk of chronic disease. They've just shrunk the heading from last time, reduce our chance of premature death, can help with maintaining your functional independence, maintaining your mobility, improving your fitness, maintaining a good body weight, maintaining bone health, and maintaining our mental health and feeling better. So as you can see, doesn't really matter what age we are, pretty similar benefits, pretty important for us all to be exercising on a very regular basis. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about the FIT principle, and this will be the main topic we're covering for today. The FIT principle is essentially just a principle that was put together to help us formulate a way to get our workout week organized a little bit better and to make sure we're doing everything that we need to for ourselves. So FIT stands for, the F is for frequency, I is for intensity, T for time, and T for type. So frequency, what this is talking about is how often will I do an activity per week? Number of times per week engaging in exercise. Subheading would be the types of exercise. A lot of these headings kind of flow into each other to create that concrete plan. So again, just a review. So Canada's recommendations were that 150 minutes. Forgot to mention for the aerobic exercise, you would want to spread that 150 minutes out over at least 3 days per week. However, the more days per week that you're making a point of getting some exercise, the better it's going to be for you overall. So we put 3 to 7 days per week of some kind of aerobic activity. Could be something like walking, running, riding a bicycle, even just marching on the spot if you don't have access to a lot of equipment or anything like that. The strength training, so this is the muscle and bone strengthening activities. Again, want to do that about 2 days per week at a minimum. For flexibility and balance, there's not specific guidelines from Canada's or from the Canadian government that has indicated that we should be doing X amount. More so, they just recommend that you do it. I would recommend on the low end of things, try to do your flexibility work at least as often as your strength training to make sure you're doing some stuff that's working on increasing your mobility, your range of motion through your joints potentially, and other things that are working on strengthening those muscles up. Balance, I put in, on the minimal side, at least once or twice. 1 or 2 days per week. Balance is something that you could probably work on every single day, just like the flexibility, if you're able to make the time for it. Depending on the type, I suppose, of flexibility and balance training. In general, these types of exercises tend to be a little lower intensity or impact, so not as tiring for the body. So you don't need as much recovery in between exercise bouts that are specifically targeting just flexibility or balance. So they are good activities you could do every day. Again, Canada's recommendations are based on the idea of, how much should we aim to do as a minimum to really reduce our risk of cardiovascular disease or other conditions. For more enhanced fitness benefits, so one, if you have a really specific fitness or exercise goal, so for example, if you were planning to be a marathon runner one day, you're definitely going to need to exercise a little bit more than Canada's minimal recommendations. So we just put in a little bit note just so you understand, you could definitely work up. Exercise is something you could actually do basically every single day. Again, you might depend on the intensities and things like that, but you could do aerobic exercise daily. Strength training, definitely would recommend at least 3 days a week if you have the time and the means to do such a thing, or if you don't have the time or means, maybe consider reevaluating to make some time. There are a lot of different ways a person can strength train. And you could strength train every day if you wanted to. Again, it would depend a little bit on the intensity levels and what types of exercises you're choosing within your workouts. Generally, if you're doing a fairly hard workout, you'd want to give at least a day break in between working the same muscle group again. But you could work different muscle groups every day in theory if you wanted to work out more. But for increased benefits, if strength training is one of your primary goals, doing more than 3 days will probably help you get there as long as you're planning effectively. And as I touched on, flexibility, I definitely would recommend doing daily, especially if you do have a job where maybe you're sitting a little bit more throughout the day. We do start tightening up, so just making a point of getting in some daily stretches, if nothing else, can go a long way. And again, the balance, as I said, on the lower end, at least once or twice a week. But like anything, the more often you're doing it, the more your body's going to respond to it, and the more likely you're going to make some of those changes. So put in, as a note, maybe at least twice a week, but just like the flexibility, I could probably change that to daily, and you'd get a lot of benefit from that. All right, so when we're thinking about our frequency, these are some numbers that you would aim for. You can see the types of exercise there that we'll talk about more later. So when we're thinking about planning this for an exercise week, you'd want to look at, how often do you want to do an activity? So for the aerobic, we talked about, at least 3 days a week, but, more days of the week are better. So for an example, you could plan to do aerobic exercise 5 times a week, strength training 2 times a week, flexibility training 5 times a week, and balance 4 times a week. And this is just going to be an example that I'm walking you through for the remainder of this presentations. So don't have to do exactly this. You could make the frequency, emulate what's going to make sense for what you're wanting to work on, how much time you're willing to set aside for it, or making extra time for it if there's not enough time to meet the minimum requirements or goals or recommendations. So another way we'd want to look at this, so if we've looking back here, we've planned out all the frequencies of these types of exercise, the aerobic strength, flexibility, and balance. Pop over to a weekly schedule that you could make for yourself, and you can pop it in here. So you can kind of see right now, here's a whole bunch of different stuff. This would be what a complete exercise week might look like for an individual, and having everything scheduled out for themselves. When we're looking at this, what would you say is the frequency of yoga specifically? And if you're looking at the schedule, you'll notice there's just 2 bouts of yoga per week. So the frequency of yoga, twice. Okay, so next we're going to talk about intensity, or the I in the FIT principles. So intensity is just how we measure how hard the activity is, the amount of effort that is required to perform an exercise. The perceived intensity can be different from heart rate indications. So we'll talk a little bit of both about how to take the heart rate to measure your exercise intensity, as well as our perceived intensities, or how hard we just think it feels for ourselves ultimately. So we'll talk about the aerobic exercise first. So generally, when we're talking about that 150 minutes that a person wants to aim for a week, we want that to be at a moderate intensity. And one way we can measure that is to find out what is 60 to 70% of our age-predicted heart rate max. And we're going to show you how to do that in the next couple of slides here. A vigorous intensity would be an intensity level that is higher than 85% of your age-predicted heart rate max. Now, when we're talking about strength, we usually would measure the intensity a little bit different. We wouldn't necessarily be measuring our heart rate during our strength training workouts. A lot of times the intensity for strength training is going to be relative to the amount of weight that we're lifting. Typically, if we're working out at a lower weight with higher reps, we'd consider that a style of training that would help build up our muscular endurance predominantly. And we put 12 to 15 reps, but truthfully, you could go beyond the 15 reps, essentially just those higher rep ranges with lower weights. I would consider a lower intensity workout from the strength training perspective. Hypertrophy training, or another fancy word for bodybuilding or building muscle, typically we might be in about the 8 to 12 rep range. Be lifting weights that are challenging for 8 to 12 reps, we would consider a moderate intensity. And then on the vigorous side of things, when we start moving towards maximal strength training, where we're lifting weights that are challenging for 2 to 6 reps, or even 1 rep, but a weight that's extremely challenging for that weight would be vigorous for that individual. It's important to note when we're talking about the strength training side of things, when we have these rep ranges, and we're calling it low intensity, moderate intensity, vigorous intensity. If you just lifted a weight that's kind of easy for you, 5 or 6 times, it doesn't randomly become maximal strength training. It does have to be challenging for the rep range that you're lifting when we're thinking about these rep ranges and the corresponding weights a person would lift. And it should be noted, if an individual does want to start working out at a vigorous intensity level with the aerobic exercise, or starting to lift significantly heavier weights, that it's a good idea to pursue that with caution. If you are a beginner, if you are just starting out with exercise, there's a lot of things we'd want to work on first before just trying to make you lift a truck, so to speak. In terms of what would classify as a beginner, or what would classify as not a beginner, essentially, if you've been training fairly regularly for 3 to 6 months, and we would classify regular as at least a half hour, 3 days a week on that 3 to 6 month basis. Somewhere in there is where you could start thinking a little bit about adding that vigorous intensity exercise, because your ligaments, your tendons, and other connective tissue should be somewhat used to the stress of exercise at that point, as well as your heart and lungs. You could push it a little bit harder. If you are an individual that does have a heart condition, or if you have high blood pressure or diabetes that aren't currently well controlled, you might want to shy away from a vigorous intensity as well. But if you're not too sure due to a medical condition, absolutely make an appointment to see your physician, and they should be able to let you know what would be appropriate at that point, or provide you with enough information or send you over to someone like myself with the appropriate information, so we could help you determine, if a vigorous intensity is safe for you if you're not too sure. But in general, if you don't have any major medical conditions that are affecting you, after you work out regularly for that 3 to 6 months, that's where you could just start thinking about adding it in for yourself. So next, we'll talk a little bit about heart rate monitoring. So as we touched on the other slide, you could take your heart rate, and that would give you probably the most, I guess, scientifically accurate idea of what. One would be to take your exercise heart rate, briefly stop the exercise, find your pulse from either the artery in your wrist or your neck in this case. So you can take your index finger, your middle finger, don't use your thumb. Place it, on the thumb side of your wrist, a little bit lower than the palm of your hand, just on the wrist there. Somewhere around there, you should be able to feel essentially a heartbeat or your pulse. Other place you can take it, you take your index finger and your middle finger again, just put it right underneath your jawline, below your ear, just follow below your neckline, all the way almost to right beside your esophagus. Put a little pressure there or hold it there, and you should feel a little bit of a heartbeat. Let you try out both of those spots. It doesn't really matter which one you use. Ultimately, they're the same heart. They're attached to the same heart in the same body. So some people find it easier to find on their wrist. Some people find it easier to find on their neck. And there are other places as well. So that's one way you can take your heart rate. If you are doing this, you would want to time yourself. So you do need a clock. So once you've established a part of your body where you can take that pulse relatively easily, you're going to have a clock in front of you, so you could use your phone if you have a wristwatch or a clock on the wall, whatever it may be. Count the amount of beats you feel in 10 seconds, and then multiply this number by 6, and this is going to give you your estimated heartbeats per minute. Other thing you could do if you find this a little tricky, obviously if you do have an actual electronic heart rate monitor, whether it's the type on your wrist that's attached to a watch or a band, or there's some that go around the chest when we're thinking about some of the more commercially available types of heart rate monitors. You could also just look at your heart rate monitor, and if it makes sense for what you've been doing, that's probably your heart rate. If you ever get kind of a weird number when you're using those types of technology, you could stop for a second, do what I just explained here with the heart rate monitoring manually, and then compare that to your device, and should be relatively close. Since we are timesing by 6, it's going to have a bit of an error factor, but ideally, we think that you should be within 6 beats per minute of whatever your device is registering as. All right. So next we're going to talk a little bit about, so how do we take that value that you just found and how do we know what it means? Am I exercising hard? Am I not exercising barely at all? So the first thing that we do need to think about is what is called your heart rate max, your age predicted heart rate max. So for this, you essentially just take 220 and you would minus whatever your age is from that. So for this example, we'll use a 65-year-old exerciser who's aiming for moderate intensity. So 220 minus 65 equals 155 beats per minute. This just gives us a rough estimate of what your maximum heart rate might be. So we take that number, we would want to times it by 0.6 to give us the bottom level of our range, and 0.7 or 60% and 70% to get a range for what we'd probably want to aim for to be at a moderate intensity. I forgot to mention a moderate intensity generally recognized as around 60 to 70% of your age predicted heart rate max. So the lower end, 60% of 155 is 93 beats per minute, and 70% of 155 is 109. So that would give this individual a goal of exercising at an intensity level that, or choose exercise that's hard enough that they're sustaining about 93 to 110 beats per minute with their heart rate. And if you're doing that 10-second count, you would have wanted to have your count be between 15 and 18 beats if you're using this method here. Other thing we want to keep in mind, medications are important. If you do have a condition or you're on a medication that requires you, or if you have a condition that requires you to be on a medication that controls or limits your heart rate, so a beta blocker would be a very common type of this medication. It's just important to note that it is going to limit your higher ends of your ability to get your heart rate up. So depending on the dose, you might need to talk to someone like myself or your physician or even a physiotherapist probably could help you out with this type of thing, just to understand the role that your medication at the dose that you're taking might have on your exercise output or your ability to get that heart rate higher. Still very important to exercise for that individual unless the doctor has instructed you otherwise. You just need to keep in mind that there would be a point where your heart rate can't go that much higher. So you can't necessarily do maximal training or anything like that, or it might not be recommended in that case. But if there is nothing that's limiting your heart rate, this method can be a pretty good method to use to gauge your exercise intensity. All right, hello again. So we're just going to start working on applying some of what we learned in the previous slides to help you measure your heart rate if you are wanting to measure it doing this method. So first thing that we're going to do, we'll just get you to take a baseline heart rate just to kind of see where we're at. You could do this sitting or standing just to see what it is before we exercise. I'm going to take mine on my wrist. You can feel free to use your neck if you prefer. Wherever you can feel the pulse, doesn't really matter which point that you're taking. It's attached to the same heart, so you're going to get the same heart rate out of it. So around my pulse there, I'm just going to get my stopwatch ready, and then we'll get us all to start timing our heart rate in 3, 2, 1, go. Perfect. So got about 15 counts there for myself. So 15 times 6. My heart rate right now is 90 beats per minute while I'm standing here. So what we're going to expect is once we start doing some exercise, we're going to do marching on the spot for the sake of this video. That's going to be a lot harder than when I'm standing here. So my heart rate should go up. So I'll let you do this drill with me. So I'll have you all standing up now. I'll give you about a 10-second countdown or 5-second countdown, and then we'll get marching for the minute here. So we'll go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and go. So you might notice that I'm marching a little bit gingerly. I do live in a condo above someone, so I'm going to be conscious of my neighbors at this time. With that in mind, if you're somewhere where you don't really have to worry about that type of thing, you're on the bottom floor or in a house or somewhere else, you could definitely feel free to march a little faster, a little bit harder. It's going to make your heart rate go up even more. But the good news is, for this exercise, it should go up no matter what, if you were standing or sitting before, and now we're marching. So we're at about 30 seconds, 30 more seconds to go. Things you can think about if you're doing marching on the spot as an exercise and you feel like you're going nowhere, you can go a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left, walk a little bit forward. So we're working on our old line dancing skills maybe. Got about 10 more seconds to go. Doing a really good job. If you want to, I would go really fast for the next 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1, and relax. So let me find your pulse again really quick. We'll stop marching on the spot. We'll give you a 3-second countdown to time. 3, 2, 1, go. Perfect. So I got about 17 there. So a little bit harder than it was before. I wasn't marching that hard, so it just went up by 2 beats over the 10-second. Remember, that's going to be an extra 12 beats on the minute. So now my heart rate would be, we take 17 times 6, 102 compared to the 90 from before. So for me, that was just with some fairly light exercise, but you can see even that light amount that I was doing got my heart rate to go up, about 10% more than it was before when I was just standing here and talking. So, and you can see, as you're exercising, you can use this method if you don't have any technology and you want to keep it somewhat accurate in terms of how to measure your exercise intensity. Use this method, see where you're at. If it seems like it's too low, go a little faster, work a little harder. If you find it's skyrocketing, you can barely keep up, and your heart rate's off the charts, it might be an indication that slow down a little bit, catch our breath, and work out at a bit of a better intensity for ourselves. But again, that's going to be relative to the person. So hopefully you found this useful and you understand how to take your heart rate through your wrist or your neck. Thanks. All right, so yeah, there's a way you can implement what we just learned and how you can start testing your exercise intensities if you want to get, kind of a more exact type of number. But there are, for those of us that don't like having to, do calculations or stop and measure our heart rate, all that type of stuff, there are a few other ways you could measure exercise intensity that are just a little bit less, specific. So first one that we're going to talk about here is the talk test. So this is a method that I'll use for actually most people that I work with here at the clinic, in the sense that, a lot of times when we're starting to begin exercise, the most important thing is getting into the habit of doing it. And, once you've established that habit, that's where you can start worrying about these intensity levels a little more if you're, not necessarily achieving the goals or the health that you would like. So the talk test is a very simple test. First, step one, just begin exercising. And step two is literally, as you increase your exercise intensity, just monitor how hard it is to talk or to carry a comfortable conversation. Essentially, when we're talking, we breathe in oxygen. When we're talking, it requires oxygen. At the same time, when we're exercising, our body also requires that oxygen we're breathing in to fuel our cells for the task that we're doing. So the harder the exercise starts becoming, we start breathing more, our heart rate starts increasing to allow for more circulation of that oxygen that we're breathing in, so that we can get more oxygen into our body. When we talk, we're starting to split the load between that oxygen. So we're using oxygen to fuel our activity, as well as we're using oxygen to talk. As the activity gets harder, it will become harder to talk because less of that oxygen will be available for that conversation you're having, which is why you start taking extra breaths to get more oxygen. So once you've started exercising, if you can still hold a fairly comfortable conversation just by, taking a few extra breaths, every sentence or every several words or so, we would be at what's called a moderate intensity. If you're getting to the point that you can barely talk while you're exercising, so maybe you're starting to take a breath every 2 or 3 words, or maybe you can't even talk at all, the exercise is so hard, you could probably assume you're at what we would call a vigorous exercise intensity at that point. So if you're not too sure when you're exercising, you don't know if it's hard enough, if you can talk basically like you're sitting at a coffee shop with a friend and just rattle off paragraphs at a time, really great that you're getting some activity, but we probably wouldn't consider that a moderate intensity type of activity. We'd consider that fairly light. It's going to help you with a little bit of movement, a little bit of weight bearing stuff, but it's not going to tax the heart and the lungs as much. So we're not going to get as much of a aerobic workout from that type of activity. Versus if you're walking and moving and getting to the point where you are huffing and puffing a little bit, taking that extra breath every several words or every few words, depending on what intensity you're aiming for personally, then you'll know you're working hard enough that you're actually giving your heart and lungs a pretty good workout in this case. And if you want to go one step even less, I suppose, testing intensive, can always do what's called a rate of perceived exertion scale, or basically just on a scale of 1 to 10 in this case, how hard do you find the activity for yourself? If it's a pretty easy exercise, so if it's a 1 out of 10, what we would give you is, that would be a very light activity. Might be, when you're sitting or lying down, usually that might be what we would consider a 1 out of 10, so to speak. But here's a scale of 1 to 10. We'll just put a little bit of, what each of these feel like, so what you're basing things on. So very easy would be, you can just breathe normally, rest of you could even sing or scream if you wanted to, probably. Getting a little bit harder with a 2, maybe we're at the point where you can talk seamlessly, but you wouldn't be able to sing to yourself. A moderate intensity is what we're actually generally aiming for. If you do have mild health complications, this is generally a safe area to exercise in. If you're not too sure, again, always consult your physician if you're unsure of your medical status. But if there's nothing too major, generally want to try to work out at least at a moderate intensity. So this is what we talked about on the previous slide with that talk test. You're just at that point where you can comfortably hold the conversation, but the breathing's a little more labored. As we get above that, so when we think about 4 to 10, just some more examples of how you could quantify it. So a 5 might be where you are starting to, take a breath every few words, starting to approach that vigorous intensity, as we talked about. Hard would be, maybe you can't talk that much anymore. Maybe you're starting to understand you can't even do this exercise for that much longer. So maybe you can't talk, but internally you got about a minute of gas left in you, so to speak. As we start getting higher up, out of 10, that's where we're at that point where it's like, what, I might need to slow down or stop right away. This is just way too hard at this point. Nothing wrong with being at a 10. All of us have a 10 somewhere on the scale for ourselves. So if you reach that, just be mindful. And always keep in mind, especially if you do have any type of heart condition, lung condition, or if you're on medications that are going to mitigate or lower your heart rate, want to be a little careful when we're pushing into these levels. And again, don't have to be necessarily 100% fearful of it, but again, consult with your physician, or if you're meeting up specifically with someone like myself, we might be able to make that determination for if we want to work out in this level or maybe just hover here. But that'll depend on the person that we're working with. So when we're thinking about the FIT principle, so we still have the frequency up there of the aerobic strength, flexibility, and balance exercises. Now we're going to start adding in our intensities. So maybe as a goal, we put down on there that we want to aim for 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensities. So this person's going to have 3 bouts of moderate intensity exercise aerobically and 2 bouts of a vigorous intensity workout, which is great. Strength training, this person's going to aim for 2 times a week, just going for a moderate intensity. So I guess in this case, sticking to weights that are challenging for that 8 to 12 rep range roughly. Flexibility, so this person is going to work out at a low intensity for the flexibility. We didn't talk about it specifically with aerobic and strength training, but there are a lot of different types of flexibility training. If it's something more aerobic, you could just kind of monitor your heart rate in that case, even if it's working on your mobility with it. If it's a strength training type of workout that also is more geared towards the flexibility, you might consider the rep ranges and the weights, but generally it's going to be probably a pretty low intensity. So this person's having 2 different types of intensity workouts, like a low intensity and a low to moderate intensity workout that week. And then we're thinking about our balance, which usually pretty similar to flexibility training. It's going to usually be on the lower end of things. Again, flexibility and balance really depends on the activity itself. But for the sake of this exercise, this person's working out low to moderate intensity levels. So how do we reflect this when we're actually planning our exercise week? So we're looking here, intensity, have on the side here, low intensity, low to moderate. So low would mean it's, more like a 1 out of 10. This would be like a 2 out of 10 when we're thinking about that RPE. And then as I said, 3 at about 5-ish here, and then this would be where we're thinking it's harder than a 5 out of 10 type of thing. But yeah, so when we're looking at the intensity, what is the intensity of the spin class for this individual? And I'll give you a couple seconds to take a peek at this schedule, and hopefully we'll arrive at the answer that it is vigorous intensity. So this person is planning to do 2 bouts of vigorous intensity exercise per week, and it's going to be a spin class that's a half hour for this individual. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the first T in the FIT principle, and that stands for time, or essentially how long you plan to exercise. So this would be talking about the duration of time you plan to spend on an exercise session, or how many sets you might be doing of an exercise. But so just to give you a rough idea of how long you're going to spend doing these activities. So aerobic exercise is fairly easy to measure. It's basically just however long you spend doing your aerobic bout of exercise. Usually, as we touched on with Canada's guidelines, you want to aim for at least 10 minutes or longer if you are able. If you're not able to do 10 minutes at a time, just doing whatever seems appropriate for yourself, with maybe a goal of getting to at least 10 minutes. And then once you get there, going longer. So for example, let's say maybe I have really bad knee arthritis and I'm just starting out, and a 10-minute walk might just destroy my knees, in the sense that I just feel totally swollen and painful. And so if that's the case after 10, but I can go for 5 minutes and actually get a reasonable workout out of it, then you would maybe do multiple bouts of a 5-minute walk for that individual. And then ideally, if a lot of their pain might be due to the condition of the muscles around the joint, as they get walking and exercising, that individual might find they can start going for a longer walk than the 5 minutes, and eventually the 10, and then longer, so to speak. Strength, flexibility, and balance, in terms of how we would measure these within the FIT principle, can be kind of variable. The reason being, one, especially for strength training, or when we're at the gym or somewhere doing our workouts, we need to consider how much time at the gym we're working out and working on our strength in this case, and how much time we might be, visiting and socializing. There's nothing wrong with socializing at the gym, but just in the sense that if we're thinking about, how long do I spend working out? If one day you talk to more people than others, the duration goes up in time, even though the actual time exercising would be the same. So a lot of times we might just let you think about, how many sets and reps you're planning to do for each of your major muscle groups, and then you could kind of estimate the amount of time it would take you to do such a thing if you're sticking to your program quite well while you're at the gym. And as I said, if you are doing the social aspect at the gym, nothing wrong with that. We are social people, but just understanding that you would want to get your full workout done before you leave the gym, if that's the case, and you just use that as your time, I guess, interval, just the amount of sets that you did in that case. Same thing for flexibility and balance. Flexibility, still want to target every major muscle group, similar to the strength training. And just like the strength training, if you have it down to a science, you could probably put an exact time on it, or just keeping in mind you just want to get through your stretches. And then the same thing for balance. Balance can be a fairly variable type of training, and the amount of time you spend specifically on balance might differ based on how much balance might be included in some of the other activities. So again, not really a specific guideline for how much time a person should spend on balance. It's something that I mentioned I think is a good idea to do every day, but the time limit on it would depend on how you're getting it into your week ultimately. So if we're looking at the FIT principle, we've gone through the frequency. So we've chosen how much of everything we're planning to do throughout the week, or how often we're planning to do it throughout the week. We did the intensity. So now we know how hard we plan to work for each of those workouts. Again, you don't need to necessarily go 110% every time you do anything physical. Some stuff you're going to work harder on than other stuff. And, our body does need to rest if we are going pretty hard, or going for the intensity. So we'll look at the time next. So for this example, we're still following along with the same person that we've been following this whole time. So they're getting in 5 half-hour workouts for the aerobic portion, so about 150 minutes, so meeting Canada's guidelines, which is great. They're aiming to do all their strength training within about a half hour, so they're going to do that 2 times per week. Again, we're meeting Canada's guidelines again. We had a few different types of flexibility training that were reflected on the schedule. So in this case, they're spending 60 minutes twice a week doing one form of their flexibility training, and 3 times 15 minutes working on another form of their flexibility training. And similar for the balance, we got 2 bouts of 15 minutes of working on some kind of balance work, followed by another 2 bouts of 60 minutes of something else that can be balance related. So when we're looking at this, how does this reflect on our schedule we made for ourselves, or for this individual that is? And yeah, so you can see this one's, the time's pretty easy to see. We got all the times on there. You can see, 50 minutes here, 15 minutes there, half hour there type of thing. So what would we consider the time for stretching if you're looking at this schedule? And again, we would see about 15 minutes on a one-off in terms of duration for one workout, or 45 minutes of stretching throughout the week for this individual. Next, we're going to want to talk about volume. So this is kind of something that we want to keep in mind, when we're talking about, all that exercise you're trying to get out throughout the week, we would consider that your exercise week in volume, or the volume of exercise that week. So that would be what it is. So volume, how much work am I doing in the week? Essentially, it's basically a product of the time versus the frequency. So if we jump here to an example, Mr. Exerciser 1 here plans to walk at a moderate intensity 5 times per week for 30 minutes. So the volume equals frequency times time. So they're doing 5 days of exercise. So 5 would be the frequency, 30 minutes per workout bout. So 30 would be the time. And this person's meeting Canada's guidelines, which is great. So 150 minutes total. So Exerciser 1 is engaging in moderate activity for 150 minutes per week. As you can see, it hasn't got Homer too stumped here. He's thinking about it. Maybe it's going to inspire him to get going for some of those walks himself, potentially. So yeah, it is important when we are thinking about the exercise throughout the week that we're getting enough per week, and the volumes of exercise that we talked about with Canada's guidelines are a good goal to aim for if you're not quite there yet. So the next T that we're going to talk about is type. So what kind of exercise? And we'll talk a little bit about why you might do these types of exercise. So we've broken the exercise down into 4 headings. You've seen these throughout the entire presentation. So we have our aerobic exercise. So that's generally exercise that is more continuous in nature, ideally at bouts of 10 minutes or longer. So our subjects here on the bike getting in a aerobic workouts. Strength training is generally an exercise that includes an external resistance or often removing our body just through deeper ranges of motion. So this could be, a body weight squat. If that's challenging for the individual doing that, would be a form of strength training. They could add some weights to it to make it go even further into strengthening the bones and muscles for this individual. Basically, a lot of the traditional stuff you see at the gym would always often count as strength training when people are lifting weights or using different types of resistance bands or other resistances to create harder movement. In terms of sports that you might consider predominantly strength training, maybe something like wall climbing, when you're pulling yourself up the entire wall, or bouldering where you're crawling across the wall, you're using a lot of musculature for that. At a level, sports that involve a lot of jumping and things like that for the legs, especially, that would be some good leg strengthening activity in that case. Flexibility. So this would be exercise that is generally low in load, but helps move our body through deeper ranges of motion. So could be variable. I mean, I would say, even when we're thinking about aerobic exercise, strength training exercise, flexibility, balance exercises, at a level, everything is helping out with each one. You're going to get some level of strength training from aerobic exercise, compared to if you just sat on a couch versus, going for a walk. A lot more strength building from the walk. Your heart's going to be working when you're strength training, obviously. But each of these, we're just talking about what they focus on the most. So flexibility could just be things like just general stretching, maybe even some of that static stretching type stuff you would have learned in elementary or high school way back when. Could be things like yoga, certain types of yoga. Might even count as strength training with the flexibility training, depending on how vigorous it is. But yeah, anything that's really focusing on getting those limbs moving a lot better and creating more mobility around our joints. And then balance is exercise that's focused on maintaining a stable position in space. So as you can see, this individual here putting herself in some different positions, maintaining a stable position in that space. And again, there'd be a level of balance training that happens with a lot of other activities in general, especially any activity where we're having to move our body through space, or just specific, even standing on a spot type of exercise for a duration of time, and changing your feet positions and things like that. So yeah, these would be the main headings that we would probably classify most exercises falling under one or more of these. So we'll talk a little bit more about that aerobic exercise. So it can improve the heart and lung health. That's usually the main goal there. The strength training, it's going to really be focused on improving that muscular strength and our bone density, our ability to manipulate objects that we're carrying around. Flexibility is something that's usually focused on, reducing joint pain, maintaining our mobility, our ability to walk or pick things up off the ground comfortably, stuff like that. And then balance, as I touched on, is going to be focusing mostly on reducing our chance of falling, improving our confidence with ambulation, so like walking or moving ourselves through space through other modalities. So the aerobic exercise. So just going to put up a few different pictures here of a lot of different things that could be considered aerobic. Again, in a lot of cases, the amount of time you're spending doing this type of activity is what's going to make it aerobic. But just some examples of, the traditional walking or jogging that most of us do, or using different types of fitness equipment like a rowing machine, treadmill here. But we could also think about sports where we're being more continuous. So, basketball, especially if you're running back and forth nonstop, if you're playing a game of pickup basketball with your friends, it usually can be pretty aerobic. Obviously pretty aerobic in professional basketball as well. In terms of the total amount of time they're spent moving. Hockey, again, would depend on the length of the shift. In the NHL, maybe a usual shift wouldn't ultimately be over 10 minutes, probably under 2 minutes. But, if we're just thinking about skating around and playing hockey with your friends and you're going the whole time, that would definitely make it an aerobic workout in that case. Now we'll move on to strength. So again, just some examples of different types of strength training, different types of equipment, medicine balls, exercise barbells, dumbbells, machines, bands, things like that. So it's actually just something that makes the movement you're trying to do harder. So your muscles have to work harder to do that movement. It can be body weight type stuff as well. Yoga, push-ups, even, to a lesser extent, if you're making a point of going up and down stairs versus walking on flat, this is going to strengthen your legs up a bit more as you're moving your body through space in a more difficult way than walking on a flat. And even touching back here, with the aerobic stuff, there is a level of strength that would be involved in hockey, especially when you're thinking about the contact you're making with individuals. Kicking the ball in a sport like soccer would have a strength component to it. But essentially anything where it's just taxing your muscles a little bit harder. And a lot of times the amount of time spent working would be considerably shorter than aerobic. You probably wouldn't do, a 10-minute straight set of, bicep curls or whatever this individual is planning to do with the barbell there. Next, we'll talk about flexibility. So we'll break down the flexibility into two common types of stretching that you've probably seen at some time in your past or currently. So we got static stretching. So this is very just traditional stretching where you would, maybe hold a position where you feel a stretch in a muscle for 10 seconds or longer type of thing. You might use a apparatus or something for assistance. So, if you've ever seen a ballet class, when they put their leg up on the bar and work on their stretching that way, they'd be working on their static stretching. And in that specific example, there could be what's called an active way to stretch your muscles. So essentially, if I want to try to stretch out my calf, so to speak, I could actively engage the muscles in the front of my shin to pull my toes towards my shin and then start feeling a stretch in my calf and hold that position. Add a little bit of an action for the one muscle working against the opposite agonist muscle there. And then we have dynamic stretching. So dynamic stretching is usually more of a fluid motion through a bigger range of motion, usually still with low load. So this would be moving through a specific and controlled range of motion repeatedly with little or no pause. So if you think about, if you've ever played team sports, a lot of times you might start off your practice with some dynamic stretching or some calisthenics or things like that. So essentially this would be, moving, as I said, the muscles through an active range of motion and, feeling that stretch and trying to, get as big of an active range of motion as you can for yourself based on the muscle that you're working. And balance. So balance, again, can look a lot of different ways. We are using our balance anytime we're walking or moving anywhere. But here's some examples of maybe some less extreme, standing on one leg, maybe challenging, but probably not as, worrying as being on the unicycle or the tightrope here. So balance is just any exercise generally where you're trying to make yourself off balance or, would have something called their base of support. So whatever we have in contact with the ground, making that less and so that it's harder to maintain our position in space. So standing on one leg versus two legs would be more challenging since we're reducing our base of support to one leg in that case. So essentially just putting yourself in some positions that might be a little more challenging than just having our 2 feet on the ground and then using your musculature to maintain that position. So when we're thinking about the types, we can pop back down here to the very bottom. So this person, if you remember back to that schedule we were looking at before, has multiple types. So one, types can be broken down, as I said, aerobic, strength, flexibility, balance, and then within those might be different exercise modalities. So this person's going for 3 walks throughout the week and 2 spin classes. So that's their aerobic exercise as a type, and then even deeper down, different types of aerobic exercise. Strength training, again, getting in that weightlifting 2 times a week, and the type of the strength training would be the weightlifting. Flexibility, so this individual is stretching on their own 3 times a week, as well as doing yoga twice a week. And for this example, we've decided it's maybe the gentler type of yoga that's focusing more on flexibility and balance. There are absolutely some pretty killer yoga classes available that would definitely fit in the strength training heading if you were taking that type of class. But for this individual, we're going to say that's not what's happening. And then the balance exercises, again, the yoga, as well as they're working on their balance a couple times a week on their own. So what does this look like when we're jamming it into our workout week? And that brings us to this final example of the schedule that this person has set for themselves. So they're getting their stretching in, balance exercises, 2 times balance, 3 times stretching. That's just their low intensity stuff. Maybe they're doing this to help wake up in the morning or as a cool down after some of their workouts or something like that. They're getting in the yoga twice a week. So again, we're assuming this is going to be kind of the gentler yoga since we're in the low moderate intensity level. Again, you might be taking a yoga class that's in the moderate to vigorous. Could happen. But in this case, we're going to consider it that gentle yoga for an hour. they are getting in that moderate intensity exercise. So as we touched on, with Canada's guidelines, good goal to aim for 150 minutes or more of a combination of moderate to vigorous. So this person getting well above that, even just the aerobic exercise itself, plus the strength training, we're going to consider moderate for how this person's going to lift. And they're getting in the strength training twice a week, walking 3 times a week, and the spin class twice a week. So you can kind of see how you can take something like this when you're planning out your exercise week. The best place to start off is, with a rubric like this, and try to think to yourself, how much exercise can you do or are you willing to do? And, is that amount of exercise the amount of exercise that's going to be necessary to get to your goals? And, the important thing to keep in mind is no matter what, anything you're doing that's more than 0 is going to have a very positive effect on your life, even if you're not necessarily reaching Canada's guidelines. Canada's guidelines are the numbers you want to strive for eventually, if it's safe for you to do so. But, if for some reason you ultimately just can't do more than 90 minutes of exercise a week, still plan that 90 minutes and still get that 90 minutes in. It's still going to have a lot of benefits compared to if you just weren't exercising at all. So yeah, sit down. It's good to come up with something like this. Use the FIT principle, plan out, how often you plan to do of each type of exercise, then start thinking about, how intense you want it to be, how much time you're going to spend doing it, what types of exercise you're going to do to fill those requirements, and, really plan your week out. Because a lot of times it might seem like we can just remember all this type of stuff, but sitting down and making a point of writing out a plan or making that commitment to yourself that you're going to do this, it's going to make you way more likely to do it. And when you have your schedule set out like this, you're way more likely to actually stretch at 7 a.m. on Monday if you've told yourself you're going to stretch at 7 a.m. on Monday and you've written it down, versus if you just think to yourself, well, I should probably stretch at some point. I've heard stretching is pretty good for you. So okay, so hopefully that all made sense to everyone there, what we're talking about in terms of just the importance of planning out your exercise for yourself, what types of things you might want to think about as you're planning that exercise throughout the week, and then ideally following through with that plan after the fact. If you do have any questions regarding the content that we went over today, my contact information is here. So again, my name is James Souchin. I'm at the Edmonton Oliver Primary Care Network. You can feel free to give me a call or fire me an email if you would like me to elaborate, or if you have any questions about anything that we went over today. My colleague Lindsay Ertman also works at the office. If you want to hear a different voice to answer some of your questions, you can feel free to contact her as well, just to touch base about the exercise prescription. Other than that, if you do have a few moments, if you could possibly follow the link here to the survey about this presentation. Again, this was Exercise Prescription 201. And just let us know, if our online lectures are hitting the mark or if there's things we can improve on. We want to hear about that. So if you have a few minutes, just follow the link right here and fill out that survey. It would definitely help us help you out a lot more. And yeah, there we go. So if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Otherwise, I thank you for joining us for this online seminar. And hopefully I might see you sometime at the clinic, or if this was enough to get you going, good luck with everything. Take care.